Hello again. The Practical Animal channel is for you if you want to know what it takes to work with animals. Today's subject is lemurs, in particular Coquerel's Sifaka, a critically endangered species. Coquerel's Sifaka is endemic to the island of Madagascar, the largest island in the world. But the world population of Coquerel's Sifaka is an estimated 200,000 animals only. My name's John Beaumont, and I visited Madagascar in 1992, visiting the rainforest at Pyrenees and seeing Indri, the largest lemur species. Join me on an around the world survey of jobs with animals as I speak to conservationists most weeks, asking them what it takes to have a successful career in this highly competitive sector of nature conservation. Last week, I talked about Chester Zoo's conservation success story with the birth of a Coquerel's Sifaka, the seventh to be born in Europe. Chester Zoo very kindly provided this footage that you see of the baby Coquerel's Sifaka and its mother. The interviews come out most weeks, and you may want to use selected questions from them in your own job interviews. Also, if you are a student of English as a foreign language, you can use my videos as listening practice for your learning, as you will hear a variety of different accents. My next guest is Lorraine Miller, Director of the Great Ape Consultancy in Perth, Western Australia. Can zoos make a difference in the fight to conserve critically endangered species? What are the main principles of lemur facility design? I mean, what goes through primate keepers' minds when they know, actually, hey, we're going to be receiving a lemur family group. How do we prepare?
Well, it's a massive question because the lemurs are the most diverse of the primates. So there are so many different lemurs, so it would be very species specific as to the design of the enclosure. So you've got your Indris and your Sifakas, which are quite large species, right down to little dwarf mouse lemurs. You've got arboreal species like the ruffs. You've got ground dwelling species like ringtails. You've got nocturnal species like eyes. So there's so many different kinds of lemurs that it would be very species specific. But for example, a lot of facilities use walk-through enclosures, very large, open-air facilities for ring-tailed lemurs, because a lot caters to that for the ringtails. So they need a large area. They're very ground dwelling. Their troop size is a lot bigger than most other lemurs, so everything kind of accommodates that kind of design. So a lot of facilities do go with that for the ring-tailed lemurs. But yeah, it's very, very species specific. You can add elements, so we'd always be looking to add specific elements to improve an animal's welfare, to encourage them to express these natural behaviours. So, for example, the Sifakas, obviously, Chester Zoo have just had a baby called Sifaka, which is absolutely fab, and they've got a very unique behaviour with the way they move. So when they move on the ground, they kind of do a little dance. When they move in the trees, they are an arboreal species. They kind of jump from the middle of one tree or one post to the next. So you can facilitate that in your design to allow them to express that really unique natural behavior. So that's all you're looking for, is to kind of get the most out of the animals and the environment and encourage them to express those natural behaviors. And it's very, very species specific in that sense.
in the case of the Coquerel Sifaka, being an arboreal species, would it just be a case of scaling down the rainforest to fit into the enclosure, or is there far more to it than that?
In theory, that would be great. Ideally, that would be awesome to have a habitat that really mimics what they would have in the wild. Unfortunately, it's not always that simple. There is a lot to think about. For example, the location. So you'd need heating, you'd need a house with heating and lighting and different things, because obviously most of the time they're not in these tropical environments. So for example, Chester in the UK does get a bit nippy. So yeah, there's elements like that you would have to consider for the location. And of course, other things, for example, if you filling the enclosure with trees is fantastic, but as long as the enclosure is big enough for those trees to regenerate once the animals start browsing and things like that. So there's things to think about with enclosure design in that respect. Yeah.
I don't begin to be an expert on breeding Coquerel Sifaks in captivity. What sort of preparations would a zoo have to make if they wanted to? Is it just a case of putting a male and a female together for half an hour, or is it a case of building up a family group over 3 years or something?
Yeah, so it is a bit more complex. So you first have to start right at the beginning with a breeding recommendation. So who you put together is very important. You want to create the most diverse population in terms of genetics that you possibly can. So we tend to get a breeding recommendation from the Endangered Species Breeding Program, so whatever region you're in. So for Europe, that would be the EEP. And then once you have your animals that go very well together genetically, it's a case of introducing them. So this is usually a slow growing process with most species. And then once they're kind of settled and integrated, and then hopefully they'll mate. But of course, you know, animals being animals, sometimes they just don't get on, or they don't they don't like each other or whatever. So it is kind of a waiting game. In terms of management, there's not too much that you'd have to do differently from a breeding group and a non-breeding group in terms of how you'd manage them. It is a kind of wait and see thing. The breeding seasons would be the only thing. So we do a lot of behavioral observations for species in our care, especially primates. They're very, very social. There's a lot of breeding of behavioral aspects that we need to keep an eye on to improve their care, make sure they're getting the best welfare, make sure that they're acting correctly and things like that. And of course, in a breeding situation, there's a lot more of those behaviors going on that we do need to keep on top of, which may also change our husbandry practices as well. So for example, if you're looking at ruffed lemurs, in the breeding season, they do tend to get a little bit more aggressive, which isn't always a bad thing. We do want our animals to express those natural behaviors, including aggression. So that's not a bad thing. But sometimes in captivity or in human care, the aggression will be redirected onto a keeper. And of course, that might create an unsafe situation. So that's something that you'd need to consider management wise. The keepers would just need to make those extra behavioral observations and just be aware in the breeding season, if you have a breeding group with, for example, ruffs, that they may get a bit aggressive, and you might need to change your management strategies around that, things like that.
That's great. Lainey, what constitutes a good, I was going to say very generally, a good lemur diet, but given the fact that you opened with the highly diverse range of lemurs that there are out there, I better make this a little bit more specific, I think. So what constitutes a good Coquerel Sifaka diet, and how do these change for pregnant females and newborns?
Okay, so most lemurs, generally speaking, most lemur species are vegetarian, so they eat things like fruits and flowers and seeds and nuts and barks and things like that in the wild. There are some species that will take invertebrates or insects as well, like the ring-tailed lemurs, and of course you've got your highly specialized species as well. For example, the bamboo lemur eats a great deal of bamboo, which luckily grows in temperate climates, so that's not usually an issue, but you do have your specialized feeders as well. So generally it would be a decent vegetable mix, so a large mix of vegetables. Some zoos do feed fruit as well, but we just have to remember that the fruit available for human consumption is very, very high in sugar. a lot higher than anything that they'd find out in the wild, and that of course does play a part in their health and welfare. So we do have to be careful about how much sugar we give them, and a baseline pellet as well to supplement their vitamins and minerals. Normally a good primate pellet or a leaf eater pellet would do the trick, but there's actually a specific lemur pellet now available. And that's mainly because of the iron storage disease. So lemurs have a tendency to store iron. So they intake a lot more iron than most other species, so they can accumulate and get iron storage disease. It's not usually an issue if you've got a good diet, but now they've created this lemur pellet, which is a reduced iron pellet as well for them. So that should kind of encompass a decent diet. In terms of diet when it comes to breeding, you don't often have to change a diet during pregnancy. So if you've got a breeding group and you've got a pregnant female, you don't usually have to change the diet. But I do recommend a lactation increase. So once the baby's born and the mother starts lactating, that's when she's going to use up her energy. That's when she's going to need a little bit extra. So we do a lactation increase then, and then you just have to remember to scale that back again once the baby starts to wean.
I think you just answered my last question, which was how do keepers transition to new diets for pregnant lemurs and when weaning newborns?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so carry on, sorry.
Yeah, so it's just a case of just making as many behavioural observations as you can, because often it's quite difficult to tell the stage and the process that the youngsters are in, because the primates will carry them around so closely. And of course, when they're feeding, you don't often know how much they're getting and things. And so you do have to make a lot of behavioural observations. And when you see those changes and they're starting to wean and they're starting to take little bits of food, then you manage your diet accordingly. So it's basically a slow process. So you slowly increase the diet. So for example, you might do it by 25% increments until your full lactation increase. And then as soon as the baby starts to wean, then you'll scale that back again 25% at a time until it's back to normal again. And then that extra food can be used as a diet for the baby as well. So it depends on how you feed your animals, because you may want to leave it in and just have the baby's diet as a group. So if you're feeding in a group situation, then you can just increase the diet that way. But if you're feeding separately, then of course you need to scale back the mother's diet and then increase the youngster's diet separately.
So when you've got a youngster, a newborn in captivity, does the management of that newborn, Lainey, require any new skills or latent skills that the keepering team would not normally need to draw upon?
Hopefully no. So it's always the hope that mum's just going to do her thing, she's going to know what to do, and you intervene as less as possible. Of course, that's not always the case, unfortunately. Sometimes first-time mothers especially, they may reject the youngster, they may drop the youngster, or something may happen. Maybe they're ill, or maybe a different animal takes the youngster, or some things may happen occasionally, and you may end up hand rearing. Again, going right back to the beginning, you'll need a recommendation. Just like our breeding recommendation, you need a recommendation to hand rear as well. And then once you've got that recommendation, you kind of need to put a plan in place, or you should have a plan in place just in case anyway. And that's when you'll need additional skills and experience. So it's very different with different species. So for example, the Sifaka, if you did need to hand rear, you'd be looking at communicating or contacting others that have hand reared Sifakas, which are very few and far between. I think this is only number 7 that's just been born in the whole of Europe.
Wow.
And there's a few more in the States, but it's a very rare species to keep in human care. So there'll be a very limited amount of experience and skills that will be out there available to you if you did need to do that. So it's a lot easier in that sense to hand rear, for example, a ring-tailed lemur, which is in every zoo, and multiple people have done that before. So it wouldn't be a problem to gain access to that knowledge. But yeah, it would develop a whole new set of challenges to do it with something like a Sifaka.
Jobs with lemurs, Lainey. I'm guessing there are, off the top of my head, 3: a consultant, a keeper, or a field biologist. Am I right, or have I missed anybody out?
Lemurs specifically, not really. I mean, you can go into research, you can go into veterinary care and specialise. Yeah, there's a couple of different things. You can go into education. I mean, there's in America, there's a Duke Lemur Center, which focuses purely on lemurs. So they've got hundreds of different lemurs and multiple different species. So if you were really into your lemurs, you could do education or something along those lines in a place like that. So if you really are specific about lemurs in general, then I guess the jobs are fewer. But primates in general, it tends to be the education route, the field conservation route, or the practical hands-on stuff like zookeeping or consultancy.
I suppose I forgot tour guide.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
I've interviewed one of those. I don't know if you've ever come across Nick Garbutt. Have you? Lemurs of Madagascar, Mammals of Madagascar writer.
All right. Yeah.
Lainey, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I have always really loved lemurs. The eye especially is just absolutely fascinating. And if anyone gets a chance to visit Madagascar or to do any research or anything on lemurs, they're just the most fascinating of species. So definitely give that a go and explore the most diverse primate out there.
Lainey, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. It's been a year since we spoke. Thank you as ever, Lainey Miller, Director of the Great Ape Consultancy.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.